Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. You guys have been sending in some really fascinating stuff, and this week we're digging into a topic that's clearly got everyone fired up, the 2024 election.
Yeah.
Specifically, we're taking a look at this group chat focused on the election, but through the lens of the Muslim American community. And let me tell you, it is a heated debate.
It really is. And it's not just about the candidates themselves, but about a whole lot more disillusionment with the two-party system. The influence of lobbying groups on foreign policy and this real sense of urgency for change.
Exactly. And one of the things that jumps out right away is how many people are struggling with that classic dilemma, the lesser of two evils thing, especially when it comes to foreign policy in the Middle East.
Right? Because for many in this community, neither Trump nor Harris seem like a particularly appealing option. They're looking at their track records, particularly on issues like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, drone strikes in Yemen, and feeling like not much would change regardless of who wins.
Yeah, and that frustration is so raw in some of these messages. Like one person wrote, and I'm quoting directly here, if what they've done in the last year isn't enough to lose your vote, what would they have to do to you in order for you to change your vote? Would they have to slaughter your children? Oh, wait, they did that already. You just don't feel connected enough to the Ummah to realize it.
That word ummah, it refers to the global Muslim community. It's about a sense of shared identity and solidarity. And that quote, it really underscores the depth of feeling here, the sense of being ignored or even worse, complicit in the suffering of others.
It's like they feel like no matter who they vote for, they're essentially condoning policies that they find morally reprehensible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a really difficult position to be in. It's no wonder that so many of the chat are saying enough is enough and looking for alternatives.
Which brings us to the whole third-party conversation, right? There's a significant portion of the group that's saying, forget Trump, forget Harris, we're voting for Jill Stein.
Which on the one hand is an understandable impulse, right? Like
Yeah.
wanting to break free from this binary system where you're constantly forced to compromise your values. But on the other hand, it raises the very real question of strategy.
Right, because in the U.S. system, a vote for a third-party candidate is often seen as a wasted vote, a vote that could have potentially tipped the scales towards one of the two major candidates.
It's like trying to win a football game by kicking the ball out of bounds. You might be making a statement, but it's not going to get you any closer to the end zone.
Okay, so we've got this disillusionment with the main parties, the allure, but also the potential futility of a third-party vote. And then there's this whole other layer to the conversation, AI PAC.
Yeah, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. This comes up a lot in the chat. There's this deep-seated distrust of AIPAC's influence on U.S. foreign policy.
Like one person put it, even Israel just does what it wants, even if Dems don't agree. It's this feeling that no matter who's in office, certain foreign policy decisions are essentially a foregone conclusion.
And that perception of AIPAC's power is definitely something we need to unpack because it speaks to a larger issue about transparency and accountability in government. Who are these lobbying groups? How do they operate? And what impact do they have on the decisions that affect all of our lives?
It's about feeling like your voice doesn't matter, like the system is rigged against you. And that's a really dangerous sentiment, especially in a democracy.
Absolutely. Because when people lose faith in the system, they're more likely to disengage or worse, become susceptible to misinformation and extremism.
Right. So we've got a lot to unpack here, folks. Disillusionment with the two-party system, the allure and potential pitfalls of third-party candidates, the influence of lobbying groups on foreign policy, and underlying it, all this deep sense of urgency for change, a feeling that the stakes have never been higher. So we're talking about this real sense of urgency for change, but also this underlying question of like, what does effective action even look like in this political landscape?
Yeah, it's like this real tension between pragmatism and principle, right? Because on the one hand, you've got people saying, look, we can't afford to throw away our votes on a third-party candidate. We need to focus on beating Trump, even if it means holding our noses and voting for Harris.
Right. But then there's this other side that's like, how many times are we going to have to compromise our values?
Mhm.
How many times are we going to have to settle for the lesser evil before we say enough is enough?
And that's where this whole abandon Harris movement comes in, right?
Yep.
It's a really interesting case study in how some within the Muslim American community are trying to navigate this very dilemma.
Totally. They're basically saying, we're done playing by the rules of a game that's rigged against us. We're done supporting candidates who take our votes for granted and then ignore our concerns once they're in office.
It's about demanding more than just lip service, right? They want to see real, tangible action on the issues that matter most to them.
And it's not just about the candidates themselves, right? There's this whole other layer of distrust directed at organizations like Engage.
Yeah, which is interesting because Mgate has traditionally been a big player in mobilizing Muslim American voters, getting them registered to vote, encouraging them to get involved in the political process.
Right. So why the sudden skepticism?
Well, some of the chat are pointing to Mgate's ties to the Democratic establishment. They're questioning their funding sources, their motives.
It's like they're saying, okay, so you're telling us to vote for Harris, but where's the proof that anything will actually change? What guarantees do we have? And by the way, who's paying your bills?
It's a good reminder that in politics, money talks.
Right.
Even well-intentioned organizations can be influenced by those writing the checks.
So it's like this whole trust but verify thing. You've got to do your own research, look beyond the surface level endorsements, and really understand the agendas at play.
Exactly. And that's where independent media, alternative news sources become really crucial because they can provide those counter-narratives, those perspectives that are often excluded from mainstream coverage.
It's about actively seeking out diverse viewpoints, even if they make you uncomfortable, even if they challenge your existing beliefs.
100%. Because if you're only ever exposed to information that confirms your existing biases, then you're not really engaging in critical thinking.
It's like living in an echo chamber. You're just hearing the same ideas reverberating back at you, and you're not really expanding your understanding of the world.
And that's something that this group chat does really well, actually. They're constantly sharing articles, podcasts, social media posts from a variety of sources. They're not afraid to engage with dissenting opinions.
Yeah, there's this real hunger for knowledge, for perspectives that challenge the status quo. And that's really encouraging to see.
It is, because it means that people are thinking for themselves, right? They're not just blindly accepting what they're told. They're demanding more from their leaders, from their institutions, and from themselves.
So we've talked about the importance of critical thinking, seeking out diverse perspectives, really understanding the systems and structures that shape our world. But at the end of the day, what does it all mean for the individual? What can one person actually do to make a difference?
Right, because it can feel really overwhelming sometimes. Like you're just one voice in a sea of billions.
So how do we bridge that gap between awareness and action? How do we move from feeling powerless to feeling empowered? It's like asking, okay, we see the problems, we feel the urgency, but where do we even begin?
Right, and one of the most common threads in this chat is this desire for concrete action, moving beyond the keyboard and into the real world.
So less talk, more action. What are some of the ideas being thrown around?
Well, some are calling for more pressure on elected officials. Organizing protests, flooding their inboxes with emails, making it impossible for them to ignore the issue.
Making their voices heard loud and clear.
Exactly. And then there's this whole other approach that's more about long-term change. Building coalitions with other marginalized groups, working to shift public opinion over time.
Because it's not just about winning this election, right? It's about creating a world where these issues are no longer up for debate.
It's about changing the system itself. And some are even saying, look, it's not enough to just focus on the outside. We need to look inward, too.
So like holding their own communities accountable, too.
Yeah. They're talking about demanding more transparency from Muslim American political organizations, pushing for more grassroots leadership, challenging the status quo from within.
It's about recognizing that real change often starts at home, right? Like, you can't dismantle a system of oppression while also perpetuating those same harmful dynamics within your own community.
Absolutely. It's about practicing what you preach, holding yourself to the same standards that you're demanding of others.
And that takes guts. It's a lot easier to point fingers outward than it is to look in the mirror and say, okay, how are we complicit in this? How can we do better?
But that's where the real work begins, right? It's about having those difficult conversations, challenging our own biases and assumptions, and being willing to grow and evolve.
So much of what we've been talking about today comes down to this idea of power, right? Who has it, who doesn't? And how can we create a more equitable distribution of it?
Yeah, and what I find so inspiring about this group chat is that even in the midst of all this frustration and disillusionment, there's this underlying current of hope, this belief that change is still possible.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless, right? We have agency, we have a voice, and we have a responsibility to use them.
Exactly. Our vote is just one tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
We can also organize, educate, advocate, donate our time, our resources, our skills. There are so many ways to make a difference.
And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply to start a conversation, right? To plant a seed of doubt, to challenge the status quo, to refuse to be complicit.
Absolutely. because even the smallest acts of resistance can have a ripple effect that we might never fully comprehend.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this question. What concrete action can you take today to make a difference in the world?
What step, however small, can you take in the direction of a more just and equitable future?
Because change doesn't happen overnight. But it does start with each and every one of us. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.